Hi, OpenXML developers. This is the third and final screencast in this series on the internals of the Identity Manager. In this screencast, I'm going to continue examining the code that handles the various editing scenarios. This code looks for inserted field codes, and if the inserted field code exists somewhere else as normal or moved to, then remove it. So this is the case where we find an inserted field code. Maybe someone just selected a paragraph and then pasted it elsewhere. They copied and pasted the entire paragraph. So that means we're going to have a field code elsewhere that's going to be a normal field code, and we have this field code that is inserted. So if we go look at this code, this will be quite a bit simpler than the last version, the last one we had to look at. So first thing we do is annotate paragraphs, and then we find the normal and move to list. So this is all the field codes that have either normal or move to field code edit status. Once we have that, we can find all the inserted field codes everywhere in the document, and for each one of these inserted field codes, we can see that the normal move to list contains it, and if it does, then remove it. So in other words, this is again back to that principle of do something that does no harm. It's if we have a field code that has been inserted somewhere in the document and we can find that same field code elsewhere, either as normal or as move to, that means we can delete that field code and then rely on further processing to tag that paragraph as inserted or tag that content item as inserted. Okay, process deleted paragraph marks. So if we find the situation where a paragraph mark is deleted and if the entire paragraph is not deleted, then that means the paragraph has been joined to the following paragraph. And what we're going to find in this situation is we're going to find paragraphs that have multiple field codes. So what we do first is we get a list of all the paragraphs in the document. We look at the markup to see whether the paragraph mark is deleted. This is the OpenXML markup to indicate that the paragraph mark is deleted. And then if the paragraph mark is deleted, then we call this method all paragraph content is deleted, and we'll find it down here. And it actually creates a copy of that entire paragraph because it helps to collapse everything so that we can determine whether there are any content items in that paragraph. By first we do a collapse, and this collapse transform does that. It kind of makes it, we get rid of all the dir, bdr, ins, move to, smart tag, stt, ppr, so on and so forth. We collapse everything. Once we get all done with that, we can look at content elements.any, and if content elements.any returns true, that means there is still content in the paragraph. Once we've determined that there is content, if all the paragraph content is deleted, then we return false. Otherwise, we return true. So this means this gives a list of all the paragraphs that have a deleted paragraph mark. And what this does is this iterates through every one of those paragraphs and goes to the next paragraph and removes the field code. So I misspoke a little while ago. A little while ago I said that you'll find that this is a situation where there are more than one field code in a paragraph. That's not the case. What there is there's a paragraph that has a field code. It has a deleted paragraph mark. There's another following paragraph, and if there is a deleted paragraph mark, then by definition, the following paragraph can have its field code removed because everything is effectively going to be merged with the current paragraph. And this follows through is if the following paragraph is a list item or a list or what have you, again, it will be merged in with the previous paragraph. So that's why this works. If we find that the paragraph mark is deleted, then the field code in the following paragraph can be deleted itself, because that entire paragraph is merged with the previous paragraph. Therefore, it's content items are in effect merged with the previous paragraph. The next one is process deleted paragraphs in cells. So if a row is not deleted, and if the filled code in a cell is deleted, and if there is another non-deleted paragraph in the same cell, then we need to move the filled code to the non-deleted paragraph. And if there is only one paragraph in the cell, then we need to undelete the filled code. The next thing is we add filled codes to all paragraphs that have none. And this actually helps us in further processing in that we can now assume all paragraphs have a filled code. So this goes through and it finds any paragraphs that don't have a filled code. It adds a filled code. Those filled codes have a new filled code ID that points to a new filled code element in the custom XML part. And I think in this particular case, it doesn't add any content items to that filled code element in the custom XML part. That adding the inserted content items happens at a later stage of processing. Okay, here's an interesting case, fixed list content items where the paragraph has been changed to a non-list item. So we can have the situation where we have a numbered list, and the first item in the numbered list contains the content item for the numbered list. And it's perfectly possible for the user to go up and select that first item and make it not be a numbered list item. So in other words, they can undo the list numbering on that list item. It now becomes a normal paragraph. But that particular content item or that particular paragraph still contains the content item for the list. And we need to move that content item to another list item that has the same abstract ID and has the same ancestor ordinals. This next case, process lists with deleted content ID. This is where we have to find a list that has a deleted list content ID, but yet the list is not entirely deleted. So therefore, the operation is to find the first paragraph that is part of that same list. In other words, it has the same abstract num ID, and it also has the same ancestor ordinals. And in that situation, we have to move the list content ID from the deleted paragraph into the non-deleted paragraph, because we want to preserve identity of that list. Just because the first item in that list has been deleted, the list still has its own identity. It has the same identity. So now this next case, we have a case where a list could have multiple list content IDs. And this happens, let's say you have a list that has 1, 2, 3, and then down below you have another list that has completely different formatting, and it has 1, 2, 3 also. So it's a different list, or it might have ABC. Well, if the end user selects one of the items in the above list and uses the format painter and paints the second list with one of the items from the first list, then that will mean that you'll have a new list that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So where before we had two lists, the first list might have list content ID of 1, and then you have various list item content IDs of 2, 3, 4, and then the second list has list content ID of 5 and various list item content IDs of 6, 7, and 8. Now we've painted that so list 5 no longer exists, and the items have become part of list with a content ID of 1. So that's the case that this handles. So once we've gotten through to this point, these are all of the operations that require that we take a look at existing revision tracking markup. We're now ready to accept revisions for that main document part. So what this is going to do, it's going to do things like If a table was completely deleted, well, up above we looked and we saw that the table wasn't partially deleted, so we didn't do anything with that table content ID. We just left everything as it sits. And at the end of this process of accept revisions for part, the entire list will no longer exist and we can just forget about it. The next operation that it does is it processes paragraphs with no field codes, and again it looks for those paragraphs and inserts a field code and inserts custom XML data for that field code. So if I recall correctly, when I was initially developing this, I put this in there, and this is an operation that does no harm. I don't believe at this point in time that this operation is actually needed, because up above here, we add empty field codes to paragraphs that have none, and I think that that does everything that this does. But one of the things that I did is I got everything working and this code was in there, and to be honest, I didn't want to perturbate the code, so I left it in there. I know for a fact that this will do no harm to the document, so I left the code in there. Let's look at this next item. The revision acceptor can leave a table with nothing in it, so it doesn't have rows and it doesn't have cells, and that ostensibly should be part of revision acceptor. I need to add that to revision acceptor, but I didn't want to impact revision acceptor for this project, so I added this code to go in there and find tables that have absolutely nothing in them and get rid of the table markup for that table. Again, down here, process cells with no field code. This goes through and looks for all cells that don't have a cell content ID and adds one. So this is worthwhile to go look at. So here we get a list of every cell in the document first, right here. Then we can do this little query where we find all of the cells that don't have field codes in there. And you'll find that we use, first of all, this descendant paragraphs trimmed, and then the next thing we call the .content items extension method, looking for any that have a content item type of cell and return true or false as appropriate from that. So we get this cells without field codes list. And then once we have that cell without field codes list, then we go in there, we new up the content item for the custom XML part, we add it to the custom XML part. We do that for the first paragraph in the cell. So in other words, we find a cell that has no content item and we add one to it. So again, one of the things that you'll see here is when we find that situation, the operation is set to inserted. So that's how these inserted values get put into the custom XML part. This process rows with no field code. This is parallel to the process cells with no field codes. This next one, process table content IDs. We find all tables that don't have a field code in the upper left cell. And if we find a table content ID elsewhere in the table, then we move it from that other location, put it into the upper left cell. If there is no table content item elsewhere in the table, then we denote that this is an inserted table. So as an example here, we may insert a row at the beginning of the table. So now the second row will have the table content item, and we want to move that table content item into a paragraph in the first cell, because that's the definition of the behavior of IdentityManager. Is when we're done, the first paragraph in the first cell in the table will have the table content item. This also takes care of the situation where, let's say that you have a table with 6 rows, and going into editing, the table content item is in the upper left cell, and then rows 2 through 6 have row IDs and so on. And let's say that the user selects the last 3 rows and either cuts or copies and inserts those elsewhere in the document. When they insert this elsewhere in the document, we have a table that has row IDs we have a table that has cell IDs, paragraph IDs, and so on, but this table won't have a table ID. And so in that scenario, what will happen is it will put an inserted content ID in the upper left cell of that table. The next one is we find all the cells that don't have content IDs and we put those content IDs there. We create the content IDs for rows if we need to. Finally, we get down here, and for any content items that don't have a content ID, that means that those items are inserted. So this then adds an inserted content ID to all of those content items. Now, we have the situation where we had a paragraph that was part of a numbered list, so it has the list content item, and it also has a list item content item, and yet this paragraph is no longer part of a numbered or bulleted list. So in this scenario, we can just go in and remove those content items. We've already done the processing to move any list content items up to another list if necessary. So in other words, if a paragraph was changed so that it was no longer part of a list, and that paragraph contained a list content item, that list content item got moved to another paragraph that is part of the same list. Another situation is what happens if the user edited a numbered list such that they added a new item to the numbered list at the very beginning of the numbered list. So this creates the situation where we have an inserted content item at the beginning of the list. And also we've defined that the behavior of IdentityManager is that you will find the list content item in the first item in the list. So this looks for the case where any list has a content item, but the content item is not in the first list item in the list, and it moves that list content item to the first item in the list. Here we've got the next situation where we find all paragraphs that contain two field codes. After accepting tracked revisions, we'll certainly have this scenario where a deleted paragraph mark causes two paragraphs to be joined together. So that paragraph will have two field codes. So we look for all of the paragraphs that have multiple field codes. And if the second field code contains a paragraph content ID, then we can remove it because that paragraph no longer exists. And if that second field code now no longer has any content IDs, then we can also remove that second field code. This last method that manipulates identity, before we do the cleanup, which I'll talk about in a minute, this last method, what it does is it removes superfluous row and cell content IDs. And this happens when the end user merges cells. So the end user can merge, for instance, the two first cells in two rows. So in other words, they select one cell vertically above another cell, and they merge those. And what that's going to do is that is going to cause that first row to have two row content items in it. And it's also that first cell is going to have two cell content items in it. Well, what we do here is we look for any row that has two row content items in it, and we remove all but the first. And we find every cell that has more than one cell content item in it, and we remove all but the first. That's the definition of the behavior of IdentityManager. And what this means is you can have a situation where you have this second row, and the second row in that situation will no longer have a row content item. And further, that cell in that row, it's been merged over top of. So it's now kind of sitting underneath another cell, and that particular cell will not have a field code, and it will not have a content item. And this is the best behavior that I could come up with for this scenario. So you just be aware that this is the situation that you can have if you start having the end user horizontally and vertically merging rows and cells. Finally, this cleanup custom XML part. This is the last thing that we're going to talk about in this exceptionally long screencast. I'm sure that this will set the record for the longest screencast that I've recorded. This one goes through the custom XML part and finds any elements in the custom XML part that are not referred to now by content in the main document part and gets rid of them. So at the end of this process, at the end of cleanup custom XML part, every element in the custom XML part is referred to by field codes in the main document part. Well, that's an awful lot of information. I expect this might be the least watched screencast that I've ever recorded, but mainly the screencast is probably there as an audience of 2 or 3 or 4, one of which is me and another is those few developers who really need to have this capability of tagging paragraphs and content items in a document with an identity and therefore with metadata.